So, welcome again. My name is Amber and I will be your host. Just a little bit about my background. I have spent many years now, almost 20, in secondary and post secondary education, working with students to help them build and reach their goals. I've also spent time with adults, helping them with new career pathways and helping them be successful as well. Play attention has been an integral part of that. And so, I want to share today ways for ADHD adults to be successful in the workplace and kind of how play attention fits into that as we get going. So let's go ahead and get started because we do have a lot to get to today. So, what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about ADHD and executive function and what those terms mean to just make sure everybody is on the same page. We're going to be talking about if you have to disclose to your employer that you do have ADHD. Can that ADHD allow you work accommodations? What would those accommodations look like and what would they include? But how can you use ADHD as your superpower to really succeed and thrive in the workplace? And finally, can play attention work as an accommodation to help you reach those goals? So that's what we'll be covering today. So first thing that I want to talk about is executive function and ADHD. So if you are familiar with the term executive function, please raise your hand. I just want to see if anyone here is familiar with that. You can just click that icon down below and raise your hand. We have a really big group today, so let me just give it a minute to make sure everybody has that opportunity to raise their hand. So for those individuals that are familiar with executive function, what are some terms that you would use to describe executive function? Go ahead and type those in the chat box and I'll share some of those with you. Let's see here. They're starting to pop up. Remember, you can just type that right in the chat box. I'm the only one that sees that. Let's see. Organization, focus. Amy writes forgetting to pay bills. So that would be if we were struggling with executive function, right? Again, I'm seeing focus, working memory, task completion, planning, delayed gratification. Great one, Cindy. Time management, procrastination, focus. So I'm getting some answers of what you would see if there's executive function. But I'm also getting some answers of what you would see if there was a lack of executive function. I'm getting focus again. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them today. So for those that shared with me today, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So for individuals that aren't familiar with executive function, let's talk a little bit about that terminology. What does that mean? So executive function is really I think the easiest way for me to explain it is it's like the CEO of your brain. It helps us plan, prioritize, organize. It helps us avoid that procrastination. So many of those terms that you heard me sharing earlier. So everybody that shared with me was right on the money. It helps us with sustained attention. So that focus. It helps us with emotional regulation. That's one thing I didn't hear, but it is something that it does help us do. Helps us have those regulated emotions. It helps us with going from task to task, right? So they're mental skills that my brain does every single day. Now, the reason why we talk about it in conjunction with ADHD is we know that very often when individuals are diagnosed with ADHD, they also have a comorbidity of weak executive function, meaning they're going hand in hand. So many different diagnoses, also not just ADHD, has that weak executive function. So when you think about the workplace and you think about those things that we just talked about, it would make sense that individuals with weak executive function, whether it's from ADHD or something else, would have a hard time in the day-to-day of the workplace. Individuals that are struggling with that executive function may find it hard to break down projects. They may find it hard to show up to work on time. They may find it difficult to get a project done in an appropriate amount of time. They may struggle with sustained attention. So there are so many different things that it can affect in our day to day. And that when those things are happening, it makes it so we're not thriving, we're not succeeding in the workplace. And it has nothing to do with laziness or intelligence. We know that individuals, even if they're struggling with weak executive function, are very intelligent. They're motivated. They have a lot of really great skills, but they're struggling with that day to day. Now, the great thing about all of this is because our brains have neuroplasticity, so that just means that my brain is moldable and shapeable at any time in our life, we can learn these skills because executive function skills aren't something that we are born with. It's something that we learn as we grow up, right? And sometimes when you have a comorbidity, whether it's ADHD or something else, it makes it difficult for us to learn those skills, but we can still learn them and we can strengthen and build those skills. And that's what we want to do to make you thrive and succeed in the workplace. So hopefully that makes sense in tying those terms together. A couple of weeks ago, we did a webinar on motivation, and motivation is also tied to that executive function, where sometimes we believe people are being lazy or they don't care, but it's actually the fact that they are struggling with executive function and they almost freeze, right? They get into that mode where they don't know which way to move. Have you, if anyone here, now you may be here because you are experiencing this, maybe you have a partner that experiences this. Maybe you're even here for a student or a child. I mean, you could replace workplace with school as well, but raise your hand if you've ever had that experience where you've gone to do something and it's almost like you're frozen, where you just don't know. Maybe it's anxiety, maybe you don't know what to do, maybe you don't know next steps, where you struggle with that. If you have experienced that, raise your hand. And it looks like so I had about half of the group today raise their hand about executive function, but I have almost at least 75% of our group that have raised their hand over that. So it's something that many of us experience. And again, we can tie that back to weak executive function. So now we need to talk about how do we change that? How do we build that? Because that's a really important piece, obviously, in us moving forward. So let's back up a little bit though and talk a little bit more. And I want to ask this question: do you have to disclose to your employer that you have ADHD? You can type yes or no in the chat box if you'd like. Do you think that's something that you have to disclose? So go ahead and share that with me, and I'm going to look through at what we're seeing now. So let's see here. It looks like, wow, I'm getting tons of answers. It looks like everyone here has typed no, and that's correct. Now, you definitely can, and we're going to talk about pros and minuses, or pros and cons of disclosing that. But you're correct. You do not have to disclose that you have ADHD to your employer. However, if you want accommodations, then you will have to. So we will talk about what is a really great way to do that. How do you approach the subject? What would those accommodations look like? But you're correct. Everyone that answered no. And so you don't have to disclose to your employer that you have ADHD. However, if you decide to disclose, what are some benefits of that? So, number one, if your employer is familiar with ADHD and they understand the medical reasons behind it, then they're more willing to understand those workplace challenges that you might have and will assist you with those accommodations, right? There's also a larger return on investment for that employer. So basically, when an employer is familiar with ADHD and they understand the challenges that can come with someone that is working day in and day out with ADHD and in turn weak executive function, then they're more likely to put things in place to help that individual be more productive. And when they're more productive, that is a better bottom line for that employer. So there are benefits here to disclosing ADHD to your employer. Now, we're going to talk about the best way to do that, because we don't want to just walk into their office and start demanding things, right? That's not going to be beneficial for us. And so, what we want to do is we want to be calculated in how we're going to disclose and what we're going to request that's going to help us with those accommodations. Okay. So, what would be negatives? All right. What are the cons around disclosing to your employer? Well, your employer may not be knowledgeable of ADHD. We have learned so much about ADHD just in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years, but even in the last 10 years, we've learned so much about ADHD. And really, when you think about it, 10 years isn't a very long time. And so there are some employers that just may not be familiar with ADHD and they may think you're making excuses. And so that could be a con. But again, we can talk about how do we approach that subject and how do we make them knowledgeable, right, of that ADHD, because that's an important piece. Knowledge is going to be really helpful in this process. If there's no understanding of ADHD, the employer may be hesitant to accommodations. They also may be hesitant to accommodations because they think it's going to cost a lot of dollars. And actually, there are a lot of accommodations that can be done for individuals with ADHD that are very low cost or almost no cost in some cases. And we're going to talk about what those look like. What are accommodations? If you're sitting here thinking, well, Amber, that's great, but I don't even know what to ask for. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you some ideas of what that would look like. Let's see here. I'm just trying to double check. We've got a few questions. And so, someone commented here, so many don't understand since they've been diagnosed in the last year, they've truly learned what that means, right? And even our own diagnosis, we really start to learn that information. So that's great. They had been diagnosed. They just were recently diagnosed, but experienced it for over 22 years. And that's very, very common when we're working with adults here at Play Attention. Many adults don't necessarily come to us for assistance and for building these skills for themselves. They often come to us for their child. And as we start talking, they start really reflecting on their own behavior and their own experiences over their life. And it really shows that there's that connection there. And so they put things in place to help them be successful, but it often makes their day or their life a lot more difficult. And when we build those executive function skills, it's a lot less difficult our day to day. Things flow a lot easier. We're more consistent. So that's really a great. Thank you for sharing that. That was really helpful. And so then someone asked, how about this factor? If you're a new hire and you didn't tell them during your interview and now you disclose this, won't they feel like they are being deceived during the interview hiring process? Anthony, and I think your name got cut off a little bit, so hopefully it is Anthony. That is a really great question. And you don't have to disclose, and you can disclose later without any repercussions. And we're going to talk about how you can disclose that without it seeming like you were trying to hide something, right? And it also depends on how your work is being affected. That's another thing that we need to talk about and look at, because just because someone's diagnosed with ADHD, it doesn't necessarily always allow them the ability to have accommodation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So thank you for sharing. So here, this should help a little bit, Anthony, in talking about how you would disclose it now if you did not disclose it during the interview process. So when we do talk about having a conversation with our employer, there are a few things that we need to do. Number one, we need to be prepared before we go in to have that conversation, because we don't want to just do it in the heat of the moment. We don't want to come in without the proper information. We really do want to provide them with lots of different pieces. And so one question or one comment I noticed in the chat room was about, what if they don't understand ADHD? And that might be your first step. That might be your step to be prepared, is having a conversation around executive function. Understanding, sharing. We do lots of webinars here at Play Attention around executive function. As a matter of fact, we have an executive function webinar series. So we broke down the different parts of executive function and shared information on how to build those, what that looked like on your day to day, and we even created ebooks. So that could be a resource to share right off the bat of not necessarily highlighting the ADHD, but to talk about the executive function piece, because that's truly what is causing difficulty day in and day out. Now, if you're interested in having access to that webinar series that we did, that executive function webinar series, it is on our website under webinars. You'll see executive function series, and you can link to that. But if you're interested in us sharing that with you after the webinar, if you just type in executive function series, we will make sure that we send you an email with that link in it, and that way you'll have it there directly. Now, please put that in the chat box, because I don't know when someone's raising their hand. I'm not quite sure what they're requesting when they raise their hand. So if you would like that resource, please just type in the chat box, executive function webinar series, and we'll make sure that you get that after the webinar is over today. We'll send you an email. So number one, be prepared. What does that look like? Outline your current challenges and concerns. So when we're requesting accommodations, or when we're starting to have that conversation with our employer, we need to outline the reasons why. Are we struggling with big projects because we don't quite know how to break those projects down? Are we struggling with time management because we have a lot of projects on our plate and we don't know how to prioritize things? So we have 6 projects and they're all very important, but I don't know which one is most important. Are we struggling with missing meetings, right? We're struggling to be on time to a meeting or just to attend a meeting. We're struggling because we have 6,000 emails in our inbox. We don't know how to manage that inbox. So there are a lot of different things that can be happening when we're struggling with that executive function. And so we need to be specific. So being prepared is gathering all of the information that you need. So it's going to take some work on your end. We're not going to just be asking for things. We're going to be explaining and showing the benefit of that. That's going to be a really important piece as we go forward. So we're going to outline the current challenges and our concerns. List possible solutions. This is something I've always used with my students, with employees I've worked with over the years. I always tell them, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with a solution, right? Because that's going to open my eyes, because they're not just coming in with, I have this challenge, I need you to fix it. They're saying, I have this challenge, but here are some ideas that I have. And that really shows that initiative going forward. So what are some solutions? And I'm going to provide you with some of those solutions. So know that that will be here and that will be available. What are the positives of those solutions? So what are those solutions going to bring for the employer? At the end of the day, the employer is going to be spending money out of their bottom line, and they want to know, what is that return on investment? What is that going to provide them that's going to make you more productive going forward? And then feature how you, the company, and your colleagues will benefit from these accommodations. Now, something that's very, very, very important that I want to talk about is, we don't want to wait until we're on probation or we're on an employee improvement plan to request these accommodations. We want to be proactive in this and really talk ahead of time before there's an issue. Now, of course, we can always talk about it when there's an issue, and you may not even realize until there's an issue that's brought to your attention that it's happening. But we're going to help with that as well, because we do have some assessments that's going to talk about what areas of executive function individuals might be struggling in. And so we will talk about that. But we want to try to not wait until there's an employee improvement plan or we're on probation. We want to really be proactive in this as we move forward. So let's back it up a little bit and talk about, can you even ask for those work accommodations, right? So you can, but there's a caveat. So in 1990, Congress passed the American Disabilities Act of 1990 to improve access to create accommodations for people with various disabilities. ADHD is recognized as one of those disabilities. However, there's just the caveat. The act only requires your employer to provide accommodations if it's not creating undue hardship to the company. Okay. So if it's creating undue hardship to the company, then it's not something that they have to provide for you. And we're going to talk about again what would some of those accommodations look like, because you may know, but you may not have really all of the ideas of what might be available for you, right? Additionally, if an individual, if it's not all ADHD, right? So there's two caveats. Number one, if it's going to cause undue hardship to the company, they don't have to require it. And number two, if it doesn't substantially limit any major life activity, then it's not going to qualify, right? So if it's not having a major impact on your life day in and day out, they don't necessarily have to provide accommodations, right? And so it's not something that they absolutely have to do. So again, that's where we want to go back to where we provided all of that information ahead of time, right? We don't want to walk in unprepared, because they don't have to provide us with accommodations. But if we're showing them the benefit, again, that return on investment, you being their investment, then that is going to make things easier as we move forward. Okay. So what would that look like, right? So what would possible solutions look like? And this is where I want individuals to share again with me. So if you've requested accommodations, what have you requested? If you haven't requested accommodations, but you think there are things that could be beneficial for you, go ahead and share them in the chat box. I'm going to look through some of those before we get into what I'm going to share with you. So let's see here. I see timers. Let's see calendars. I see cubicles. So again, if you've requested anything or you think of things that might be beneficial to you, what would they be? Go ahead and share those in the chat box. Flex time, so flexible time, right? Let's see here. I've got some other questions through here, so let me get to make sure here. Okay, so one individual mentioned here, my problem was estimating how long my work would take. So I wasn't sure what to ask for. So that's a great one, right? And that's part of that. I'm not sure how to break down that project. And so if I'm not looking at those different pieces, I don't know exactly what I need, right? So that's a great one. Later hours, one day a week to catch up in peace. Noise canceling headphones, task priority. That's a great one. These are all great. Let's see here. Okay, so there are some more in here, but I want to get to, we're about almost halfway through our webinar today. So I want to make sure that I'm sharing everything with you today so we don't run out of time. First thing I want to mention before we get into recommendations or options that we are going to provide for you, a really great resource is JAN, Job Accommodation Network. And I don't have the link available in this email or in this webinar. However, we have created an ebook, and in that ebook is going to be some of the information that we've talked about today, but also references and resources and the links that you can go to directly to look at accommodations, to look at places where there may be funding available if your employer is looking for funding. So at the end, I'll give you the opportunity. If you're interested in receiving that ebook, we can send that to you. That way you have it. And one of those references is going to be JAN. So if you've never looked at JAN before and you've never looked for any, you looked at that network, that is a really great resource for you to use, because we're not going to obviously be able to hit on everything today. And so this is something for you to look at going forward. So for someone that is experiencing hyperactivity and impulsivity, right? So they're rushed by nature. And sometimes people think of impulsivity as bad behavior or poor choices, and that's not always the case. Impulsivity is I'm rushing through things and I'm making silly mistakes. I have a really hard time sustaining my attention on something that's a little bit more mundane, maybe a little bit more boring. little bit more challenging. Maybe I don't know what I need to do in this. And so my impulse is to move to something that I do know how to do. It can show up in perfectionism. So there's a lot of different ways that impulsivity presents itself. And so some individuals wouldn't necessarily see themselves as impulsive, but day in and day out, certain things that they do really show up as that impulsivity. So some of the ways that if you or someone you know is experiencing hyperactivity with their ADHD, impulsivity with their ADHD, providing structured breaks as a physical outlet. So some individuals find it really beneficial that a couple times a day they get up and walk outside, right? They get up, they move around, they walk around the building, they walk up and down the hallway, and they get that physical activity out, that impulsivity, that hyperactivity. But we want to make sure it's structured. We don't want to just say to our employer, okay, every 10 minutes I'm going to get up and walking down the hallway, and then they see me talking to my colleague more than half of the day, right? That's not going to be beneficial for them. That's not going to give them that return on investment. But getting up or even stretching, even if you take, every couple hours you get up and stretch, and that is good for us, even if we're not experiencing this, and really reallocating that activity, that stimulation. Utilize a job coach to teach and reinforce techniques. So, when we are building and learning skills, it is very helpful for us to have a coach and to have someone there to really help reinforce because these are new things for us. We're learning new things and we need to have that accountability. And so, if someone can be there and help provide you tools and resources and then follow up and help with that accountability, especially in the beginning, it's going to be really, really helpful. Allow employees to work from home. Now, we're seeing that more often since the pandemic. A lot more employers have been more flexible with working from home. However, we need to make sure that if we're working from home, we do have that structure and that schedule that's going to be effective for us. We don't want to just go home and not follow through with some of those things. So if you're requesting potentially a work from home option, then you're going to need to be able to present a structure of what that looks like, how people are going to connect with you, what are those timelines are going to look like, right? So again, very detailed, we want to provide that. And maybe it's not working from home every single day, but maybe it's a probationary where you try it 1 or 2 days a week, and then you try it for 2 or 3 months, and then you and your employer follow back up with that, and what are the positives and what are areas that we can improve on, right? Review conduct policy with employees. So we want to make sure that everybody is on the same page, and this really goes to expectations. And I think sometimes it's a disservice to employees that we don't provide them with expectations upfront of what is expected in the job. That's one question I always like to ask in an interview is what are your expectations? I also like to know what their management style is because as an employee, how you perform, right? And how you work, and you want to make sure that those two methodologies are working together, right? They're working in tandem. So have those conversations as an employer, as an employee. Use the EAP services. This is the employee assistant program. Many companies, especially corporate companies, have an employee assistance program. Employee assistance program, if you're not familiar, it's always free to the employee. They will offer referrals, short-term counseling, recommendations. It's an avenue where you can get support for certain things that you're requesting. Provide a private workspace. So someone mentioned that earlier, and it is something that is beneficial if you're a person that is highly distractible. Putting you in a place that there are very few distractions is going to be beneficial for you because you're not going to have those distractions all of the time. So either having a place where a door can be shut or cubicle walls, noise canceling headphones, right? And so those are the types of things that we can request or that can be requested of us as an employer. Let's see here. Focus and concentration. So if somebody's struggling with focus and concentration, we can provide, again, a quiet workspace. So if you're in a place that's very noisy, then the use of noise canceling headphones, someone mentioned that earlier, or white noise, right? Maybe we need something playing at our desk. Maybe we need, noise, or we need music in the background. Now, of course, we have to be careful that we're not disturbing others. And so we have to be really aware of that when we're requesting these types of items. So again, a quiet workspace, working from home, if no effective accommodations are done can be done in the office environment. So that's a great way to kind of talk about that work from home option. So a first option would be a more quiet workstation, work area. And then if something like that is not possible, then is there a potential for some time for me to work from home, that option? And I do find that sometimes if your home option isn't quiet, right, you need to make sure that is the appropriate accommodation for you. If you have someone else in your household that works from home, if you have, maybe small children at home and there's a provider that comes to your house to watch them, is that always going to be the best option for you as well, right? So I have kind of a split option at my work where part of the week I'm in the office and part of the week I'm at home, and both lend me benefits, right? And so I work my week around certain tasks of when I'm going to be in the office versus when I'm going to be at home, and that's another great tool to use when you're requesting this. What would be the type of things that you would do from home, and why would it be more beneficial for you to do those there? So again, we're always going to provide them lots of detail, lots of information. Uninterrupted work time. So this is great. One of the positions I held in the past, someone mentioned late work hours, right? Working late one day a week so that they could get caught up. And during this position that I held, I had numerous employees that reported to me. And very often their schedule would allow them time to leave a couple hours early on Fridays. And Fridays was always the time that I chose to work late, because a lot of times as a manager, when you are dealing with individuals that report to you, it's sometimes hard to get uninterrupted time, right? There's a lot of things going on. There's potentially a fire that needs to be put out. There's meetings that you need to attend. And so I would always carve it into my work day where Friday would be the day that I would work later than normal because I would get that uninterrupted work time. And so that might not mean you work late, but maybe you can request for from your employer every morning you get an hour where it's uninterrupted, where you can plan your day, you can go through your emails, you can do that, and that's going to set you up for the day. But then we got to make sure that's what we're doing in that time, right? So things like that. Taking allotted breaks is needed. I'm guilty of this, taking lunch at my desk, right? Working right through it. And I think for our mental health, just for how we perform as individuals, taking those allotted breaks is beneficial, right? Maybe that means going outside and getting some fresh air and moving around, and maybe having a lunch that you can walk and eat lunch at the same time. But taking those breaks and really quieting your mind, right? And cutting that and then coming back refocused. It really, studies show that when we take that time away and we come back, we are more focused and we are more willing to work and move forward. Minimalize marginal functions, allowing them to focus on their essential job duties. So this can be really difficult for employees and employers. Employees need to make sure that they're not getting a ton of small tasks that are minuscule, that are taking away time from their large tasks. And so as employers, we need to be really aware. And I think a benefit is, if we can do this, putting tasks with people's strengths, right? So if somebody does a great job of building webinars or writing ebooks, that's what their focus is. Yeah, they have some other tasks, but that's their priority. If somebody's good at doing functions, putting functions together, let them focus on that. If you have that individual that has a tendency to hyper focus, right? So a lot of times if someone lacks focus, there are certain things that they can hyper focus in on. So with that hyper focus though comes great detail and great information. So can we put them on something that we need a lot of detail on, right? And so looking at strengths versus these are all the things that this person has always done in this position. What does that look like? What can make us maybe leaner and stronger as a company? And so that might be something. And if there are certain tasks that you feel like you do that are marginal and they're taking away from your big tasks, that's where you go in and you list all of your tasks and say, okay, this is what I have. This is what's eating up a lot of my time. So I'm unable to focus here, right? And what can that plan be to make this more balanced so that these marginal tasks are not eating up those big ticket items as we go forward? Time management. So time management can be really tricky. And as adults that are struggling with executive function is generally one of the big areas that when I talk with adults day in and day out, they struggle with. It's something where I can't make it to my appointments on time. I'm struggling to make it to my meetings on time. I take forever to get a task done. I don't get my tasks done, right? So time management can show up in a lot of different struggles, right? It's not always the same. Again, there's not a one size fits all for everyone. So ways that we can help individuals with time management is going back to that first, where I talked about a coach, a mentor, a partner, an accountability partner. Assign them somebody to help them with that, to do that check-in. Provide to-do lists with deadlines. I think this is great. There are so many tools out there that we can assign tasks and we can assign deadlines. And in addition to that, we can assign check-ins. And I think that's really important to remember is that if we have somebody that has a 2-month task, not to wait until the deadline to have that check-in, right? We need to have that check-in earlier to make sure that they're on the right page, that things are moving forward to have those, right? What does that check-in look like? And providing deadlines. So not necessarily providing a deadline of the actual deadline, but what is this? Let's break that project up for them and say, in 2 weeks, this is what I want to see. In 2 more weeks, this is what I want to see, right? And so have that to do with deadlines associated with those. Meetings to discuss expectations. If somebody's putting you on multiple projects, beginning meetings should always talk about what are these expectations? What is my job in this? Is my job the whole project? Is my job this project? Do I have to wait on this person to do my part of the project? What does that look like? Let's have a detailed conversation so I know all of those points. Assistance with prioritization. Somebody mentioned that earlier on the chat, and that is so true. Many times, like I said, our plate becomes full with tasks, but what is the most important? And even if I don't struggle with prioritization, it still may be difficult for me to know what is number one. And that's something I always fall back on as an employee. With even if I have reports to me, I still have an employer, right? I still have my own supervisor. And so that's something I always fall back on. If I feel like my plate is getting too full, I go back and say, okay, my plate is really full. What does that priority look like? What are you expecting from me? Again, expectations with that prioritization. And then assistive technology. That could include timers, apps on your phone, apps on your computer, calendars. I know I'm a huge proponent of Google Calendars. And our office, we share everything on our Google Calendar. So we can see everybody's calendar and they can see my calendar. And that really helps with managing priorities, managing tasks, because we can see what's there, what's available, right? And so that's really helpful, and that can be beneficial. As an individual, I find it very helpful as well to have everything on my electronic calendar. So I use Google Calendar, and everything that happens in my life goes on that Google Calendar. all personal and professional together, because I find that's the easiest way for me to manage all of those different things. If you've attended any of my webinars before, you know I'm a mom of 2 teenagers. And so they have a lot of different activities, a lot of different things that need to fall into place. And so it's very important that things go on the calendar so that I'm aware of all of those things and it's not a surprise, right? And so let's see what we can do next, right? So those were some opportunities for you. Again, if you're interested, I'm going to give you the opportunity to request that ebook that's associated with this when we get close to the end here. But what can Play Attention do to help? This is really where we can provide tools to really help you, because sometimes if we're really struggling with these skills, we have to build the skill first. The calendar is not necessarily going to be helpful. If you're looking at me right now and you're saying, Amber, I've tried every calendar that's out there. I've tried every organizational app that's out there, and it doesn't work. It maybe works for a week, maybe 2 weeks if I'm lucky. Then I'm right back to the beginning. And the reason why those tools aren't working is because we have not built the skills yet. And that's where Play Attention comes into play. We have to build those skills. I always tell people, if I give you a drill and you've never seen a drill before and you don't know how to use it, and I give you a drill, a screw, and some pieces of wood, that's not going to necessarily be helpful for you until I teach you how to use it. That's what we want to do. We have to teach you, and we have to build those skills. So number one that we can do in that skill building step is identify what skills you might be weak at, right? Because number one, there's not a one size fits all. Even if I had two 41-year-olds both diagnosed with ADHD, they're going to present differently. They're not going to be the same. And so we're not going to teach them the same things because they are different. And we want to customize that to work for that individual. So the first step that we're going to do in that process is we offer the brief assessment. Now, if you've been around, you may have heard us talk about our assessments before, but our brief assessment is a questionnaire-based assessment. So you are going to get an assessment, and it's going to have 75 questions on it. And it is looking at your behaviors as they relate to executive function. So it's going to break down those behaviors in executive function sections, categories, and show us areas that you may be weak in. And then we can determine a plan to build those areas, because we may know, okay, I am late to meetings. I struggle to remember everything that's talked about in a meeting. But we might not know all of those pieces, like I mentioned earlier about impulsivity. I talk to some adults that are impulsive and they don't realize that they are. They tell me, Amber, I don't think I am. And then we start talking about what really impulsivity looks like and what it can look like. And then that really opens their eyes. So sometimes we are unaware that certain behaviors fall within those areas of executive function. And so this gives us a really great way to pinpoint those areas, to look at that. And so you'll have the opportunity, if you're interested in doing one of these assessments with us here at Play Attention, we'll talk about that when I wrap up on the last slide. But know that that's available to you, because as an adult, sometimes we're not even diagnosed, so we're not quite sure, or we get an ADHD diagnosis and then we don't know what the next step is. We don't get a plan. And that's what Play Attention is going to provide for you, is we're going to identify areas that need improvement, and then we're going to build that plan, and then we're going to take that action. That's really what we need to do. And that's what happens so many times, where we don't meet those goals and we don't make those changes because we know it's there. And maybe we set some goals, but we don't create a plan and we don't have those action steps. And that's what we want to do here at Play Attention. So how do we use your ADHD as your superpower? I mentioned that a little bit earlier about one thing about individuals that maybe have hyperfocus, how beneficial that can be for an employer. So this is really ways that employers that are here today can use, but also ways you can show your employer how things that are ADHD can benefit them with just maybe a little bit of accommodation. So harness your ADHD attributes and improve your outcomes. So when we start to leverage our superpowers from ADHD. And you may have heard us talk about that. And I really do believe it. ADHD, there are superpowers that are accompany ADHD, things that individuals can do that are really, truly phenomenal, but we need to harness them, right? We need to make sure that that hyper focus is directed and it's used for a benefit, whether it's a benefit at home, a benefit in the workplace. I mentioned that earlier. If you have somebody that has that hyper focus, put them on a task that requires a lot of detail, a lot of research. You are going to get so much information out of that. You have somebody that's high energy, put them with customer service, have them interact with customers. Someone that is high energy, they're generally positive, they're excited, and they make great salespeople and great customer service representatives. Do you have somebody that's a creative thinker? Have them start to think about, what do processes look like? What do next steps look like? How can we make that adjustment? Put them on tasks like social media. They'll be really creative in creating things to draw customers and clients into the business. Do you have somebody that has strong emotions? Strong emotions, as I mentioned, emotional regulation is part of that executive function. But if you have somebody that's very, very passionate about something, again, they can be great salespeople. They can be great customer service people because they're so passionate and so they believe so much in what's happening. And then someone, we talk about impulsivity, but really that can be creative or calculated risk taking, both creative or calculated risk taking, where they are actually taking that risk, but they're not doing it without looking. And that's where, in building that impulse control, we can become that calculated risk taker. There are so many entrepreneurs and inventors today that are diagnosed with ADHD because that is very common. A position that's very beneficial for individuals with ADHD is an entrepreneur because they have more flexibility, they're creative, they're calculated risk takers, but we want to make sure that we build that ability for task initiation, right? They have to have that too. And so combining this with those executive function skills are going to make somebody unstoppable. It really makes them the whole package. So how can play attention help in the workplace? So play attention specifically is designed to build executive function in both children and adults. We use a 3-part program. We use neurotechnology integrated with cognitive training and behavioral shaping. And we use those pieces together to build executive function. And so when we build executive function, we are actually building neural pathways in the brain. And so I talked earlier about neuroplasticity. So our brains are moldable and shapeable. And so again, that means anytime in my life, I can learn new skills as long as I have the right tools, and my brain can change if I have the right catalyst. And that's what we're going to bring to the table. So we know certain catalysts need to be present when our brain makes changes. They're attention, deliberate practice, and challenge. Those things have to be present when we're building a skill, and we're building a skill with permanency. Because when we build a skill, our brain does change. When we start to learn a skill, we start to develop a new neural pathway in our brain. And those pathways can be weak, they can be strong, and they can be permanent. So think about skills that you do every single day and you barely think about it. Tying your shoe, that's one of them. We learn how to do it, we practice and practice until we know how to do it with permanency. And with our program, you can do the same thing with your attention and your executive function. And attention is our foundation. And what you see here is our neurotechnology, and we've done webinars on that as well. But neurotechnology, what we do here is we're actually able to pick up brain activity indicative of attention. So I actually have my body wave armband here. And what it actually is able to do is there are sensors on the back. And when those sensors are touching bare skin, it's actually able to pick up brain activity indicative of attention. So basically, when someone is in their optimal level of attention, their brain gives off a very specific electromagnetic signal. This device is listening for it. Now, the reason why all of that is important is because you're going to be working on specific cognitive training modules, but they're all going to be triggered by your attention. So when you're in your full attentive state, you get your module to operate the way that you want. Your character does what you want. You get the task that you need to do, and you're having that very deliberate practice of that skill. But at any time, if you lose that attention because you get distracted, because you become inattentive, because that internal dialogue starts racing, that attention signature stops firing. And now your game is going to give you feedback. It's either going to freeze or your character is going to do the opposite of what you want it to do. And now all of a sudden, we're getting that immediate feedback of attention, and we're practicing our attention and those different cognitive skills. So it's a really important piece in building those neural pathways and creating them with permanency, because that's what we want to do. We want to create these neural pathways so when you eventually graduate play attention, you have these skills, you have them permanently, and you can use them for the rest of your life. And that is the goal here. And we're using that technology with those cognitive training exercises with a behavioral shaping program. And then the behavioral shaping program is going to help you with those self-distracting behaviors that sometimes accompany our inability to focus in and follow through with certain things. I wanted to share this. We're getting close to our 2 o'clock hour here, so we're starting to get close on time, but I wanted to share a couple of success stories or testimonials from some of our adult clients. Because again, we do work with both children and adults, and we have many adult clients. And so here is one of our adults, and he talks about cognitive improvements in other areas of his life that involve executive function, right? So he saw evidence in improved memory, less impulse, and less distractibility, right? So all of a sudden, he was able to do those more mundane tasks, those more complicated projects, because he had the ability to do those skills, because he was working and training and building. And I think that's an important thing to remember with play attention is you're doing these exercises on a computer, but they transfer into your everyday life. And so not only do you have the opportunity to start to see them in everyday life, you're going to have the opportunity to practice them in everyday life as well with our academic bridge. And you can start to use the play attention program when you're doing work projects, and it's going to bring you back immediately as soon as you lose that attention. And that's helping with that transfer and generalization. Another one, and this is one of my favorite, we had a young adult here in his early 20s, and he had dropped out of school because he was struggling so much with the workload. He was unable to ignore background noises. He was struggling in the workplace. He was struggling with school. So he dropped out of school and he found us, and he is back in school now and working on his bachelor's degree. In addition to that, he's more successful in the workplace because now he's able to filter out those distractions, which is a part of our executive function, stay focused in on his clients, and maintain his focus for a longer period of time. And the great thing is it doesn't take long periods of time to start to see those improvements. Just like when we're exercising our body, if we're consistent, when we're exercising our brain and building these skills, we start to see those improvements fairly quickly. And as we continue to train and build these skills, they get stronger and stronger, and we eventually get to that permanency, right? So we have much more success stories on our website if you're interested. And then we have some testimonial videos as well. You can visit our website and take a look at those. So as we wrap up today, I wanted to give you all some opportunities for some additional items if you're interested. So we have the assessment. So normally our brief assessment is $50 per assessment, but as a thank you for attending today, you can do that assessment at half price. So you can do that assessment for $25. All we'll do is we will gather some information from you. We will then send you out that assessment. You will do the assessment. Once the assessment's completed, we will also do about a 45-minute review with you on that assessment. We'll schedule time. We'll go through all of the pieces, and we'll really create an action plan of how to build those skills so that you're successful, and also how play attention is going to help in building those skills. So if you're interested in doing that assessment, the half price assessment, you can type in assessment. One of our associates will reach out to you, just gather a few pieces of information, gather your payment, and get that assessment sent over to you. Does not take very long. You just have to answer those 75 questions. And then again, we will get you on the schedule and we will work through pinpointing those areas and helping you create that action plan. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and type assessment. If you'd like to learn more, I just barely touched on play attention today. But if you're interested in learning more about play attention and how specifically it would work for you, obviously an assessment is a great opportunity for that. But if you want to do a one-on-one consultation, please type consultation. Our consultations are about an hour. We do them over Zoom, and we will go through, we'll ask you questions, and we will talk about play attention. We will get into the details about play attention and how specifically it would work for you. We'll cover all of those different pieces. So if you're interested in that, you can type in consultation for that. We'll reach out to schedule that. Our next play attention webinar next Thursday is going to be on our assessment. So if you're not quite sure if an assessment's right for you or what an assessment would look like, you can always attend our assessment webinar. So Gwen will be doing our webinar next week on assessment. So if you're interested in that, you can type webinar and we will get you registered. We will record it just like we do all of our webinars. It will be Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern time, like our webinars. But again, as long as you're registered, you'll get that replay. So if you're interested in learning more or you want to share with your employer and you want them to learn a little bit more. And that's another thing about the consultation. If you want us to have conversations with your employer, we can do that as well. That's not uncommon, and we can work through that. Again, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.